Hello lovely people, welcome to another book chat, the weekly roundup of stuff I've read at some point in my past.
Sofie vlogs.
I have 4 books I want to talk about today. Shall we crack on? I'm going to start with my fiction. This is Conclave by Robert Harris. I think I talked about The Second Sleep in my last book chat, if I've remembered my timings correctly. I've been working through books that my dad had lent me. This I actually really enjoyed. This is, he has this disclaimer at the start of this book where he's like, any resemblance to people living or dead is entirely, not deliberate. And I was like, based on Pope Francis though, isn't it? So essentially, like, the Pope is dead, and then the cardinals have to elect a new Pope. So it's all about, like, the machinations, the political intrigues, all of this sort of thing. The Pope who has died in this bears a striking similarity to Pope Francis in, like, the types of principles he espouses and stuff. So he's quite a progressive pope in the grand scheme of things, and he's very much about like lessening some of the corruption within the church, and also like specifically in regards to like the way that the Vatican's like finances are functioned and like stuff like that. So what forms in the wake of his death is sort of like this political struggle between a more conservative faction, a faction that wants to continue the progress. Our main character in this is Cardinal Lamelli, and he's an interesting viewpoint to have throughout this because he is the person who's in charge of like organising everything. So when they do the vote, he's the one who at the start reads out like the text you have to read out, and he goes first and that sort of thing. So he is attempting at the start of this to maintain neutrality, and his aim is just to the preservation of the church. He wants to get this done as smoothly as possible, so then like everything can keep on going. As you might expect from this book, that's not exactly how it goes down. There's lots of information revealed. There's lots of like controversial stuff comes out about candidates and stuff like this, and it sort of tests our main character as to how impartial he can remain. And I found this really interesting. I have been to the Vatican, I visited it, so it was interesting partly from like a lived experience point of view, because like they're in the Sistine Chapel and doing the voting, and he's like staring at all of these images, and I was like, I too have stood in the Sistine Chapel and stared at these images, but in wildly different circumstances. Interesting from my point of view because I'm not Catholic, I've not been raised Catholic, I don't know a lot of stuff about how Catholicism works. So it was interesting to get like just the insight into it, and then like all of the political machinations. My favourite parts of this were the bits when information, you're like eking things out and you're coming up with ideas and stuff like this. I gave this a 4 out of 5 stars because I was quite gripped with it. There are aspects about the ending like that I predicted. There's like a thing at the end which a lot of people either seem to really like or really hate, and I kind of just feel okay with. I don't know, I think there's some things to consider, but on the whole, like, I ended up really enjoying this. And I think the type of Robert Harris that I'm most likely to enjoy is stuff that is not, like I watched the film of Enigma, and my partner read Munich and stuff like this, and I think I'm less interested in the ones that are like inserting a fictional character into a real life moment, and then sort of just giving you history, but from like a different character's perspective, if that makes sense. And I'm more interested in ones that are like their own thing, just because when you already know history, and so that can really affect whether or not you're going to enjoy the telling of a tale. I don't know if that makes sense. Shall we talk about some poetry next? I also read American Primitive by Mary Oliver. You may remember that I absolutely loved Blue Horses by Mary Oliver, and I just kind of wept over it when I read it in the peak of my probably my most stressful months in the pandemic so far. I don't know when this is going up. I'm recording this in December, for context. So most stressful pandemic months of 2020, I think. It was interesting comparing this to Blue Horses because this is a earlier collection of hers. They are both quite nature-based, but very different kinds of natures. Like Blue Horses makes me think of like still lakes, rolling plains, like herons. Like there's a particular type of natural world that Blue Horses makes me think of that is quite like still and solitary but interconnected and stuff like that. Whereas this is sort of the, as you might guess, like the wildness, like swamps and forests and stuff like that. It's just like the types of nature imagery it evokes for me is quite different. I gave this a 4 out of 5 stars. I didn't like it as much as Blue Horses because what I loved about Blue Horses was like some of the stillness and grace that was at the centre of it, and there are aspects of that here for sure. There are aspects of that probably throughout all of her poetry. It seems to be something she likes. But Blue Horses was written from the perspective of like an older woman who's been going through cancer treatment and stuff like that, and it had like a distance and a maturity and like a reflection aspect to it. This is sort of like down in the dirt and the mud, which I also enjoyed. It's just a different vibe. There was a whole poem about mushrooms that I just really loved. It was like really early on, and I was like, we're going to get on well. So this is exploring very different, like wild, untamed sort of aspects. There was also sort of an aspect of this as well that felt like kind of love and desire and that sort of stuff, and like relationships and passion, but sort of done through like a wilderness aspect. I don't know. Mary Oliver is one of my favourite poets. I have accepted that about myself. It is very interesting comparing and contrasting different collections. You know, often I'm tempted to, when I love a poet, to just buy like their collected poems, but actually I am enjoying the process of consuming her work in its collections as it was intended to be read, because each collection does have a different vibe, a different theme, a different mood that is like tying all of these things together. And it was just interesting to compare this particular mood with the other one that I've consumed. If you have a recommendation for where to go next, do let me know, because I'm gonna be reading all of her things. Okay, my next 2 books are non-fiction. Editing Sophie here, just hopping in to redo my talk about Happy Fat by Sofie Hagen. It's on my radar because a few years ago now I saw Sofie Hagen doing the promotional tour for the book. It was very funny, I really enjoyed it. When I originally recorded this, I didn't know that Sofie Hagen is non-binary and uses she, he and they pronouns, so I just wanted to redo this just to reflect that. So this is a book that is really dismantling fat phobia and looking at fatness in relation to a lot of different topics. I thought this was a really well put together book. I found it immensely readable. I think she strikes a really good balance between personal anecdotes and life experiences, humour, but then also really delivering on a lot of stats and figures and stuff like this. So it's that great combination of personal and general. I also really liked that they brought in other voices. So in between these chapters that are focused on different topics, you have interludes where Sophie is talking to a different person, and often these interludes are focused on a specific lens. So, for example, she might be talking to someone who's discussing how their fatness intersects with their blackness. She might be talking to someone who's talking about how their fatness intersects with their disability, and just sort of like these identities that Sophie does not share. He's really bringing in people who can talk confidently on their experiences with those intersections of identity, and I just thought that was a really great way of doing it. They do talk about in the chapters where it is them talking about their own personal anecdotes and stuff like this, the stats and figures they're using do apply on like a wider basis, but I just thought it was a really great way of sort of acknowledging where her own experiences sort of end. I don't know if that's the right word. When we're having these greater discussions, it is important to like recognise like, oh well, I'm like this person, so I have had these experiences, other people have had these experiences based on like all different parts of identity. I think it's a really great book. If you're someone who is also interested in sort of like unlearning fat phobia and stuff like this, I think it's a really great place to start and also continue your journey. The final book is one that I have less positive feelings on. This is Hammer of the Gods, a biography of Led Zeppelin by Stephen Davies. Essentially, my main thing is that I just think that Stephen Davies' style of doing biographies is not my favourite. I talked about Gold Dust Woman, which was his biography of Stevie Nicks. I'll leave a link to that down below in my autumn reading wrap-up. I have much the same problems here, whereby his main source for this appears to just be their ex-manager, who is heavily quoted, but at no point does he question whether maybe their ex-manager might have an agenda. I just feel like we very heavily relied upon that one source. I also just don't really like his writing style. I don't think it's a style that really works for me. It feels a bit disjointed, kind of feels like just a bunch of Wikipedia articles strung together oftentimes. I also just had a similar thing that I've had a couple of times coming away from rock biographies, where I just don't like anyone involved in the band anymore, really. I had this, like, more overtly with The Dirt, but I didn't particularly like Motley Crue in the first place. definitely opened my eyes to a bunch of stuff about Led Zeppelin that I did not know, and now I don't really like them as people. But that's not always a problem. Like, I thought that The Dirt was a really well put together book, despite the fact that I came away thinking that they were all terrible people. I think the book itself was very well put together as, like, a piece of media. I just think that this wasn't very well put together. I don't think his writing style is very good. He has this strange thing that he does where he, like, has a topic. With the Stevie Nicks book, he spent the intro sort of creating this like mythologized Welsh witch identity that he then did absolutely nothing with for the rest of the book. And in this, he does a similar thing where he spends the intro like building up the myth of like the Crossroads deal and blah blah blah, which again is not really very relevant. And he really focused on like the Aleister Crowley connections and stuff like this. It just feels quite like sensationalist, but then he never really kind of does anything with the sensationalist. It's just sort of like, did they make a deal with the devil? It's like, no, they just made some really terrible decisions, took a lot of drugs and did some shitty things to people. Like, sometimes that's all it is. It's definitely been an interesting reading experience, reading a lot of like music-based biographies recently. I've enjoyed the process of it. I just think that ending on this one was not such a good decision because I've read some really good ones, and I think potentially it's made me harsher on this because I've read ones where I'm like, this is how you do a rock biography, you know? So I wouldn't recommend this, and I don't think I'm going to read any more Stephen Davis books because they're just not to my taste. At the same time, I understand that a lot of rock fans will read this and they'll really love it, and I like entirely, like, you do you boo, happy for you. It's just not my jam. On that note, if anyone would like to recommend me music, biographies, autobiographies that they really like, I would love to hear them because I have been really enjoying exploring again. It doesn't have to be classic rock based. I've just been reading a number of those because my dad lent me these books. And that's his style. Those are all the books I wanted to talk about this week. As per usual, I would love to hear your thoughts, would love to hear your feelings. Do leave a comment down below. Otherwise, hope you're having a very lovely day, and I'll see you next time for something different.